Okay, yeah. Okay.
Welcome
Yeah.
to the Geospatial Forum. It's a pleasure to be able to kick off the fall series this year with actually two major events. First, the arrival of Dr. Mirela Tulbure. So wonderful to see all the smiling faces and presence here in spite of the storm looming in. But anyways, yeah, it's really wonderful having Mirela here. As many of you know, she was hired into the Chancellor's Faculty Excellence Program for Geospatial Analytics with her academic appointment in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources as an associate professor. So we're incredibly excited. She's here, lots of anticipation. She moved all the way from Australia to join us and got here late summer from the University of New South Wales. And anyways, I think we all know a lot about you, so I'll let you take it away from here. Thanks, Mirela.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ross, for the kind introduction. And thank you all for coming with the hurricane looming around the corner. That's really dedication, so I really, really appreciate it. Just by show of hands, how many of you are grad students? I'm just curious. So a lot of you. And faculty? A few of you. And what else? Research scientists? Okay, so it's postdocs. Research scientists are there. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So I'll try to ask you a couple of questions to hopefully keep you engaged and somewhat entertained, and also for me to learn from you as I go through my talk. Just to start out, I'll be talking about remote sensing and spatial analysis of surface water extent dynamics, vegetation, and landscape connectivity in a dryland basin, and the work that I've been doing with my team over the past couple of years in Australia. So the work is on Australia. So just to start out, why do we need geospatial analytics for surface water resources? Because it's changing, so it's dynamic. Sorry? Because of hurricanes. So it's really dynamic. We have a lot of hydroclimatic variability. We know that rivers meander. We know that lakes shrink and expand. We know that farmers irrigate and flood their fields. We know that engineers build dams dry out. So it's really important to capture these dynamics. And of course, having just static layers might not capture all the processes that we might be interested in. In general, surface water is obviously very important, but in arid landscapes, surface water is critical not only for hydrological cycles, but also for biogeochemical cycles. Arid lands cover about 1/3 of the globe, and they are shown here in different tones of orange. Just out of curiosity, who else is working in arid lands? We need to start a trend. So arid lands cover, again, 1/3 of the globe, so we need to start a trend. And they are highly dynamic. So this idea of looking at surface water and different processes in dynamic landscapes is really critical, and hopefully I'll convince you by the end of the talk that it's really important to capture those dynamics. So the southeastern part of the US, as you would all know, faces water problems and water supply shortages. And of course, on a day like this, it's kind of hard for me to think of it as, well, this region has a problem with water in the sense that it doesn't have enough water. But I guess we all know that the region has gone through hydroclimatic variability. It's been through a big drought, and then, of course, the hurricanes. Who's been here during the drought, the 2016 drought? Quite a few of you. What have you seen on the ground? Like, what did you experience? Any changes? What did you see?
My yard didn't do too bad.
Your yard didn't. Yeah, that makes sense.
Shortage of availability of feeds for livestock.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Were there any restrictions, like how long your shower could be, or any restrictions on water usage to water your yard?
Right from did not offer you cold water, did not offer you ice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
In the plant. If we do not ask.
So the region obviously has water supply shortages, and climate changes will impact the area in terms of higher population as well as a drier climate, as well as very high hydroclimatic variability, and of course the elephant in the room is the hurricane. So it's important to look at these dynamics here. In Australia, we have a pretty similar in some ways and very different in lots of ways systems. So what do you know about Australia? What do you know about, other than kangaroos and crocodile Dundee, of course, what do you know about the landscapes in Australia?
Fire.
There's a lot of fire. So if you study fire, that's a good place to be in.
Study snakes, it's a good place.
If you study snakes, yeah. There are a few things that that happen there.
There's a decided rainy season, right, as opposed to a drought season.
Right, up north, yeah, in the tropics, yeah.
There's a gradient from tropical to arid.
Yeah, there's a lot, yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, so you could do studies across gradients. And it's the driest inhabited continent. So water is really, really crucial, and it's critical. And it's really, again, water. If you study water, that's another good place to be in. Australia is also impacted, like the systems would be what we would call boom and bust systems. So they go from drought to floods. So I guess very high hydroclimatic variability like here. It's also one of those places that has been impacted by climate change really badly. So the Climate Change Commission has put out a couple of reports pretty much every summer. And that's because climate records have been broken every summer. And just a couple of years ago, the Bureau of Meteorology had to come up with a new color scheme to add to its color scheme to accommodate temperatures soaring above 50 degrees Celsius, or about 125 Fahrenheit. So that's happening, and it's been happening, and just a little earlier this year, we've been through a major drought. Now, farmers are out in Canberra, in the capital city, protesting about the drought, and when the farmers are out protesting and asking the government to do something about it, that's a really big deal. Farmers in Australia don't typically do that. So that's a really big deal, and of course this made the cover of the Time magazine earlier this year, talking about this big drought. So in this context, the study area that we have been working on is the Murray-Darling Basin. The Murray-Darling Basin is located in the southeast of Australia. It's a pretty large dryland basin. It's over 1 million square kilometers. It's about the size of the Four Corners states. It's very important to Australia, not only ecologically. It has the largest rivers in Australia, so the Murray River and the Darling River. I keep forgetting that this actually doesn't work on the screen. And then it's also very important to the country because that's where most of the agricultural production happens. That's also where lots of cities get their water from, and it's also where irrigated agriculture happens. And it's also been going through a pretty major drought, a decade-long drought, the Millennium Drought, basically the worst that has happened in the southeast of Australia, which ended in 2010 with big floods that were primarily driven by La Nina. So in this context, and also working together with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, we wanted to integrate geospatial analytics and remote sensing and looking at how do we actually quantify the surface water extent dynamics, how do we quantify some of the drivers and look at vegetation dynamics as well as connectivity dynamics, and how do we put it all together to come up with a broader view picture of the system. So the first thing that we've done was to develop a remotely sensed data set of surface water extent dynamics using the Landsat Archive. We use Landsat 5 and Landsat 7 going back to 1986 up to 2011. We used the entire archive of data, and we had about 200 core hours on the national computing infrastructure. We developed random forest models to map every single pixel, so it's a 30-meter pixel every 16 days, into water, clouds, or land. So the key thing here was that this was seasonally continuous. So among the students that are taking Josh's class, what's the big deal? Why is it important to look at seasonally continuous time series?
see the dynamic patterns over time.
Over time. So not just, so typically with time series of satellite data, we might have had, say, a snapshot once a year or a couple of times a year, but it's important to not only look at the interannual variability, but also intraannual variability and try to tease apart seasonality. Who's using HPC among the grad students? The CNR HPC, what's a core hour? We need to use it more. So basically, it's about 1 CPU on your typical desktop for 1 hour. So you need a HPC to process the entire Landsat archive. I guess that was the main point of this. So once we had these almost 3 decades of seasonally continuous time series of surface water maps, that was pretty cool because we could do lots of nice things with this data set. So just a couple of things to give you an idea of what the data set looked like. I'll just go through some frequencies. So surface water frequency in 2006, so one of the years during this time series. So basically what I'm showing you is how many times a pixel has been flagged as flooded during the time that pixel has been mapped during that year. So that's 2006. You hardly see anything, right? So that was the driest of the Millennium Drought years. So that's why there is very little water or close to no water in these maps. However, in 2010, the picture is very, very different. We've had lots of big floods, primarily in the southeastern and northeastern part of the basin, and this rectangle right here is about the size of New Jersey. So those were massive floods that affected cities, and they captured a lot of attention. Just to show you an idea of the spatial detail that you can get with Landsat, which is, I guess, primarily why Landsat is very useful for this, I'll just quickly show you results of our surface water mapping with blue overlaid on Landsat images. I'll just go through a time series starting at the end of the Millennium Drought until the beginning of La Nina floods. So you'll see quite a bit of dynamic. That lake on your right-hand side is Lake Victoria. It's about 15 kilometers east to west, just for scale. You'll see a lot of dynamic along the river, so in the floodplains, and then you'll see a little more dynamic south of the river. And then with yellow, you'll start seeing results of our modeling of clouds. Obviously, we're trying to mask out clouds. We're not interested in clouds. So you can start seeing quite a bit of dynamics. So just out of curiosity, what are these? What do you think triggered this water here? There is actually localized rainfall, but yes, these are fields. So you can see some of the dynamic that we can capture with the with the spatial resolution of Landsat. We then did an accuracy assessment. So I guess how many of you are using remotely sensed products in their work? Everyone, pretty much. What do you look for when you download a remotely sensed product?
Accuracy.
And what do you pick? What kind of accuracy are you looking for?
With the indices or the products?
Right. So, but like, what's your typical? So, say what would you pick? What would be your typical number that you might be looking for?
Well, the NLCD is about 88%.
88%. So typically over 80%. So I guess the thing that I'm trying to point out is that whenever you're downloading a remotely sensed product, it's really critical to look at the accuracy assessment. The rule of thumb is to be above 80%. It's actually a very important step in developing a data set, and it takes about as much as developing the data set, and at the end you only have a couple of numbers. But it's critical. It's important to know how much you can trust the product. It's important to have the uncertainties associated with it, so basically to be able to have standard errors around your accuracy. So in our case, our producer's accuracy or omission error of water was around 85%. So we were happy with that. And if you're interested in reading a little more about this work, it was captured by NASA Landsat Science team, and yeah, it describes the work in more detail and with more appeal for management implications. We're currently using the harmonized Landsat Sentinel 2 product, so the newer satellites, to basically have a denser time series, because even though we have seasonally continuous time series of surface water extent dynamics, we're missing lots and lots of floods. We know that. And with Sentinel-2 data, we're capturing a little more of these floods, but ideally we would get even higher temporal density of data to capture floods such as this. Right, so once we had these time series at our fingertips, it was pretty cool to do some analysis with this data set. Here is an animation of flooding frequency per year, going all the way from 1986 up to 2011. So you can see that the place is really dynamic. Again, drylands are really dynamic to start with, and this is a particularly dynamic place. There are a few things that jump out. First of all, that there is less water during the Millennium Drought, but also that even during the Millennium Drought, there are still some areas that are being flooded. So there is a little more to it than just there is less water during the Millennium Drought. Here is another way of looking at the data set. So basically I'm taking the entire time series and I'm looking at percentage water across this entire basin. So again, over 1 million square kilometers per season per year on your x-axis. So I guess just looking at this way of displaying the data, what do you see? What are some of the key things that you see? The Millennium Drought was here, so 99 to 2009. Right, so there is seasonality to it. So we're seeing, again, the broader patterns that there is less water during the Millennium Drought and more water during La Nina floods, but there is a change in seasonality. And again, having this seasonally continuous allows us to capture and try to understand how did the drought affect water resources also per season and this seasonality. For example, you see that before the 90s, we used to have lots of fall floods, whereas after that, those fall floods pretty much disappeared. You can also see that even during the Millennium Drought, we still had pretty large summer floods. And that's an interesting thing in itself that characterizes the surface water dynamics and how that impacts drought. The other thing to point out here is the maximum amount of water that we've seen. It's only 2.5%. Now this is over 1 million square kilometer basin. So it's really dry. Like even when it's wet, it's really dry. So water is really precious in this area. Of course, having this data set, you can slice it and dice it the way you want, not only temporally, but also spatially. So basically this is looking at the northern basin versus the southern basin. And these are two large water management units that are quite different. You can see here percentage water on your middle top row, percentage water per year, and then on your right-hand side top row per season per year, again percentage in this northern basin. And again, you can start seeing and disentangle some of these dynamics over space as well. Looking at the northern basin, this is a very dry, flat area which has a lot of water coming in summer as a result of summer downpours, whereas the southern part of the basin shows a steady decline during the Millennium Drought, and most of the water comes up in spring, primarily as a result of snow melt in the Australian Alps, which are located on the southeastern side of this basin. One key thing that most of the catchment managers were interested in knowing was, well, this basin is great, and it's great that you can do this across this entire basin, but we're really interested in our catchment area primarily. So again, with this data set, you can again slice it and dice it the way you want, and you can provide the local managers with the data the way they wanted for the area that they wanted. the next thing that we wanted to do was to look at some of the drivers, climatic drivers in surface water extent dynamics. And this was work that was done by one of my former PhD students, Tino Heimhuber, who's now Dr. Heimhuber, and he's a postdoc at the University of New South Wales. And in Tino's PhD, we really wanted to understand what are the major climatic drivers of surface water extent dynamics. Now, if you were to do this type of work, what kind of drivers might you use for this in your own work? Soils data.
Vegetation, vegetation.
Vegetation also, okay, cool,
Impervious
yeah.
surface.
Impervious surface, yeah, cool. Yeah, I'll definitely add these to my next iteration. So in Tino's case, we didn't use impervious surface, but we did look at soil moisture, evapotranspiration, rainfall, and river gauge data. So I guess we used some soil moisture data. The way we approached this was top-down using a data-driven type of analysis. So we split this entire basin into eco-hydrological zones that were done prior to us arriving to the scene. And then because we wanted to get a higher spatial resolution of these models, we'd split the basin into 10 by 10 kilometers square, so basically applying a grid on top. And then as our dependent variable, we had surface water extent that was our Y variable, surface water extent dynamics over time, so there was the time series. And as our explanatory variables, we had rainfall data, soil moisture data, evapotranspiration, and we had river gauge data. And the way we assigned a river gauge per each of these modeling cells was using the hydrologically reinforced river network to make sure that the river gauge that we assigned corresponds to the river area in the modeling unit, if that makes sense. And then we applied our models using these data sets to 3 different areas, and we picked these 3 different areas to be quite different in the way they have their water resources allocated. So first of all, we picked one that's less developed. That's the one to your right-hand side. This is one that's quite developed, the Murray area, and then the Murrumbidgee area is one of the areas that have a lot of irrigated agriculture. And what we found was that our models explained about 70% of the variability in surface water extent dynamics for 2 of these regions, which was pretty good to start with because we only had climate variables in there. And for Murrumbidgee, we did pretty poorly. And so we looked at the data and the place, and the reason why we didn't do so well is simply because there is a big water diversion scheme that happens here. There's a lot of water that's being taken out for irrigation, and none of our variables capture that. So that was reassuring to us in a way that the models actually, I guess, did what they're supposed to do. So that was so reassuring to us that we applied it across the entire basin, and we looked at climate drivers across the entire basin. And what I'm showing you here on your left-hand side is R-square values, and on your right-hand side is reduction in RMSE. So basically areas that are shown in red are areas that capture more of this variability across the basin. So what you see here is that the northwestern part of the basin is where climate has a more important role in explaining this variability in surface water dynamics. Now, why did we use a data-driven approach? There are, I think, some eco-hydrologists in the room. Could we have used the hydrological model? What are some pros and cons of these 2 approaches? Is this useful? Would you do this?
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you. It's published. It must be useful.
I think it's limited. It's limited by being able to explore like future processes, like scenarios of change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's static.
Yeah, so it definitely has pros, but it also has cons. So it has limitations that you can't explore future scenarios unless you use, I suppose you could use synthetic river flow data project it into the future and then use that as a model. What else might you gain or might you lose when using this type of data-driven versus physically based models?
Well, if you don't care about the process,
Mm-hmm.
maybe more accurate than the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So if you don't care about the actual process, this might give you, it definitely gives you insights. This is a large basin, so it's typically easier to parameterize hydrological models for a smaller area. We're always data poor when it comes to parameterizing hydrological models for these areas, so it's good to have a data-driven approach. It's also one of these approaches that you can start applying and then you can zoom in into certain areas once you identify certain patterns that you might want to use hydrological models for. And because this is such a dryland basin, with hydrological models you actually don't capture some of the evapotranspiration that happens in the basin as well as the soil infiltration, because water takes a long time to get from point A to point B of the basin, and you can't really capture that with hydrological models. So this was one of the main reasons, or this was among the main reasons why we picked a data-driven approach. But in work that I want to start here, I'm really keen to start incorporating these two approaches and marrying those up, so I want to talk to you more. And then besides looking at hydroclimatic variables, we also wanted to look at land use change. So we added land use change layers. We had 8 layers of historical land use change. And what we found was, again, that climate was more important in the less developed part of the basin, the northwestern part, whereas land use change was more important in the southeastern part of the basin as well as the central part, where we had a change in land use from irrigated or natural environments to dryland agriculture. Why is it important to look at land use change in a basin that's so hydroclimatically variable?
That's, land use is going to affect the timing and volume of flow of the rivers that you're detecting.
Yeah, that as well as, I guess in this part of the world, the narrative has been for a long time that, well, there is so much hydroclimatic variability, we have droughts, we have floods, there isn't a whole lot that we can do about it, right? So the idea is that, well, with land use, land use change is really important, and that's something that I think in lots of studies is probably not used enough, in my opinion. And there are synergistic effects of climate and land use change, and of course this is one of the things that we can actually do something about. It's harder to trigger lots of actions for changing hydroclimatic patterns, but this is something that we can actually do something about at the local level. So we were quite happy to see that land use change was really important, and where that was important across this entire basin. The other thing that we were interested in was to look at vegetation dynamic in space and time as a function of flooding dynamics. So one of the key things with vegetation dynamics is, and flooding in this area, is that it impacts the carbon cycle. And there's been a pretty, I guess, famous paper by now that looked at carbon sinks across the world. And they came up with these numbers that there was a major carbon sink in 2011 that was triggered by vegetation greening in the southern hemisphere, and a lot of it was actually due to the La Nina floods that trigger lots of vegetation greening in this basin, in the Murray-Darling Basin. This is also important in the context of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, who's trying to decide where to allocate water as environmental flows. So basically a lot of the riparian vegetation shows dieback, and they are trying to mimic natural flow regimes to basically restore some of these riparian areas. And they're trying to understand how much water to put where to get the effect that they want to get in terms of vegetation greening. And there's been quite a few studies looking at vegetation dynamics as a function of either rainfall as well as flooding. And there were studies that said, well, rainfall is really important, flooding isn't that important. Others that said, no, flooding is really important, rainfall isn't that important in this area. But those were smaller scale studies, and of course, it's region specific. So here we wanted to take this more holistic approach, again, across the entire basin and look at both rainfall as well as flooding. So what we used was an index of vegetation greenness. And again, those of you that are taking Josh's class, what's a vegetation index? NDVI, yay. So we used EVI in this case, but a measure of vegetation greenness derived from Landsat, and we used our flooding layers derived from the same data set, as well as Bureau of Meteorology rainfall data. And then we used a breakpoint regression, which basically tells you where you have a changing coefficient in your regression. So basically, do you have a change at some point in time during your entire time series? So some of the major things that we found was that it's not just flooding or just rainfall, is that the synergistic effect of those two actually triggers the highest greening events. We also found that the first year of breakpoint corresponded pretty much with the beginning of the Millennium Drought in most of the basin, with the exception of some agricultural areas where we had lots of irrigation schemes that started in these areas right here. The other thing that we found was that this relationship was spatially and temporally dynamic. So there were certain areas where rainfall was more important than flooding, and flooding more important than rainfall, and that mattered where in the river system you were, closer to the river channel versus further away from the river channel, and there was a lag effect in this whole relationship. So that was, again, very insightful, and I guess for this we crunched through quite a bit of data, and again, that was quite insightful. And if you're interested in reading a little more about it, again, it was captured in a NASA Landsat newsletter. We then wanted to look at vegetation health. So not only vegetation greenness, even though sometimes we might be using vegetation greenness as a surrogate for health, but in other times you might not. So we wanted to look at vegetation health and whether that has something to do with flooding. And so for this, we focused on one specific area. And this is work that was done by Yuri Shendrik. Yuri was a PhD student in my lab, and he's now a postdoctoral fellow at CSIRO. Basically, the whole background of his work was that we have these river red gums. It's a species of eucalypt. They are these really big, majestic trees, riparian trees. They are quintessentially Australian, like the koalas, right? So they've been there, they've adapted to these systems. They need flooding to be able to sprout. When there is a drought, they drop branches, and they have these amazing complex structures. They grow 30 meters tall, and they have these complex structures. The older the trees are, the more complex those structures become. And the reason I'm dwelling on this is that when you try to identify those individual trees, is not very easy from the data that we had. And there have been lots of episodes of dieback of river red gums, and lots of people said, well, it's got something to do with the reduction in the flooding frequency, and there is anecdotal evidence to suggest that, but there was no study to combine the two and put the two together. So basically, that's pretty much what we set out to do here. So to start out with, we collected airborne LiDAR and hyperspectral data. This is the forested area, Barmamilwa Forest, that we worked with, about 750 square kilometers. And of course, we couldn't capture the entire forest, and we collected data, airborne data, across these red strips that you're seeing. And then we wanted to look at tree health and link that to flooding. So I guess, how many of you have used LiDAR data before? Lots of you, quite a few of you. How would you go about delineating an individual tree?
Take the canopy height and then you look for the peaks.
And then you look for, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, so that's what most people would use it like the canopy peak and then use something like an inverse watershed algorithm and delineate the canopy. Well, in our case, that failed miserably. These trees have complex shapes. We couldn't get any trees out of it. So instead of taking this top-down approach of looking at an apex, we decided to try a bottom-up approach and see if that worked. So what Yuri did was basically he used LiDAR intensity to take away the understory in 0 to 10 meters where we suspected the trunks would be. And then we used Euclidean distance algorithms which basically linked those points based on their location, and those became the trunks. And then we used the top of the trunks as seeds in a 3D graph, and then we connected all these points based on 3D graphs and the distance between these points. That was the weight. And then once we had these 3D graphs, we wanted to split them to get to individual trees. So what we did for this was random walker segmentation to basically decide which crown each point would belong to. So basically what they gave us was going from an unorganized point cloud to these individual trees. And so then if you look along one of those LiDAR strips, you would see these individual trees. So the different colors would represent different individual trees. So we were happy with this. We got an accuracy of about 68%, which may not sound like much, but again, given the forested area that we were working with and the kind of trees and that we were trying to get individual trees, we were super happy. We then wanted to look at tree health. And so for this, we did a lot of field work and a lot of measurements in the field. And we did a lot of visual assessments to look at basically tree health. So this would be a typical healthy tree, declining, or dead trees. And once we had that, basically what you see here on your left-hand side is 3 crowns, with yellow are the ones that are declining, red are the ones that are dead, and green are the healthy ones, overlaid on top of Landsat flooding frequency, which I showed you before. And then on your right-hand side, you have this displayed differently. On your x-axis, you have flooding frequency, and then on your y-axis, you have number of trees in each of these health classes. So I guess looking at these 2 graphs, what do you think? Is flooding having anything to do with tree health or not? Yeah, it does seem like it. So it looks like a flooding frequency of, say, greater than 5 to 10 would have areas with healthier trees than very low flooding frequency. And that was really important and really insightful primarily for the managers, because they wanted to understand how many times would this area need to be flooded to understand how to get healthy trees. And then if that area wasn't flooded that many times, could they add environmental water as environmental flows to this area to basically produce more healthy trees? So we'll see how that goes when it's actually applied in practice. And so when you do field work in the Australian outback in the bush, you get to see lots of really cool wildlife. So we were super excited to find the nest of emu birds. And by the time I was away, I had to go back and teach, and my team was left seeing all these cool things. And they did pretty much, once they saw this emu bird, which is about 2-meter tall bird, they did pretty much the only logical thing that one can think of, and they took spectra of the eggs. So there you go. The last thing that I'll be talking about is looking at assessing dynamic connectivity based on surface water networks. And this was a big component of the work that we've been doing and we will be doing here as well. And the way I'm talking about connectivity is really the way I guess landscape ecologists would use the term. So I'm not talking hydrological connectivity as in the way hydrologists would think of connectivity. And why is that important? Primarily in dryland areas. Well, hopefully I convinced you, showing you these animations, that these are highly dynamic systems, so they go from very dry to very wet. There are surface water bodies that would merge into one big one, and then they shrink to smaller ones. Even temporary or ephemeral water bodies can be really important, particularly during drought conditions, because they can act as stepping stones in time or in space. And I guess a lot of the previous studies were looking at some localized areas, arguably because it's not easy to do large areas when you look at connectivity. So the way we approach this, again, is by using graph theory based on network analysis, whereby each of these habitats would become nodes in a network or in a graph, and then they would be linked via edges, which can be distance or resistance distances. How have you seen connectivity or networks? Can you think of networks that you might have encountered in your day-to-day? Transportation. Your Facebook network. So each of your friends would be the nodes in the network. Edges could be anything from how well connected you are. So networks are everywhere. They've been everywhere. I guess in ecology, we've started using them in the past, I don't know, 10, 20 years? I don't know. Not for as long as they have been used in other areas of study. The importance of using a graph theory based on network analysis is because we can look at capturing some of the network topology, and we can capture this systematically consistent over space as well as time. And we can identify areas and hopefully habitats that are really important to conserve when we have limited resources. So what are some of the most important things that habitats can be in a network? So you have your connectivity hub, which would be the one that's the most connected in a network. So it's like your most popular friend, or you might be the most popular one in your network. So ecologically, this is important because they can act as refugia during environmental disturbance. And then you can also have nodes that are acting as stepping stones. So unlike hubs, they're not necessarily very well connected, but they're really important. Why are they so important? Say again?
You remove it and
Yes, exactly. If you remove this node, pretty much the network structure collapses. So they are critically important even though they are not as well connected compared to hubs. And ecologically, they're useful for organisms to move long distances. So basically, when you have adaptations to climate change, you need to have these stepping stones for organisms to move from point A to point B. So this work was done by Robbie Bishop-Taylor, who's now Dr. Robbie Bishop-Taylor. He did his PhD on surface water networks, and he's now an Earth observation scientist with Geoscience Australia. And for Robbie's work, we were interested in looking at certain, I guess, species that might be useful for connectivity analysis. So we settled on amphibians for a couple of reasons. For surface water networks, amphibians are really good because they depend on the water habitats, but also on the land use between these water habitats. So that was kind of convenient to us. The other thing that was, again, convenient was that the southeastern part of Australia is a hotspot of amphibian decline globally, and we don't really know why they're declining. It could be a loss of connectivity or a loss of habitat or a degradation of these habitats, but we don't really know what's going on. So it seemed like a really good idea to start investigating that. In amphibian studies looking at connectivity, a lot of them would have had, say, a static habitat, and they might have had something like a Euclidean distance. So as the crow flies from habitat A to habitat B. Obviously, that's not very realistic. Lots of studies, though, have used a least cost path type of algorithm. What's a least cost path example that you can think of in your day-to-day or in connectivity studies?
Sidewalks.
Say again?
Sidewalk between two
A sidewalk, yeah, between two buildings. I heard that, I've actually learned that the hard way. I don't have a car yet. So my first day on campus, I'm trying to walk. And my phone tells me, go on Western Boulevard. So I did. And so I had to cross two highway entrances, basically, and there is no stop sign. So I basically decided that's not my least cost path. I need to find a different way, so I now walk via campus. Any other example, ecological?
Trails in a park.
Trails in a park. A greenway. Perfect, yeah. And corridors. So basically least cost paths are kind of the way we look at connectivity. However, when you look at organisms, least cost path might assume that the organism actually knows what the least cost path is between habitat A and habitat B. And it turns out they don't necessarily have an inbuilt least cost path algorithm. There are actually studies that looked at amphibians saying that they don't know what the least cost path is. So a better way, a more realistic way of coming up with this is basically look at, again, random walkers using circuitscape, so the way the current would move through a circuit. And basically, instead of just having a single path, you would have multiple paths from habitat A to habitat B, and they would give you a little area that you can think of as connecting these habitats. So in Robbie's first paper, we started out with a static surface water layer from Geoscience Australia. And then we wanted to incorporate some dynamics, and at that point, we weren't done with our Landsat time series. So what we did was using flooding scenarios, 1 in 2 years, 5 years, 10, 20, 50, and 100 years. And then we wanted to map where were these areas that were important as hubs and as stepping stones. So basically what I'm showing you here are 2 rows of maps. On your top, you would have the areas that were important as hubs, and bottom, the ones that are important as stepping stones. Red areas are more important. And then going from left to right, you have no flooding scenarios, so the static water maps going to 1 in 100 years flooding. So what you see going from left to right is that you have more red on the maps. So you have more important habitat for connectivity as you have more water in the system. That makes sense. You have more habitat, more connectivity. The other thing that was pretty cool for us to see was that areas that were important as hubs seem to correspond with areas that were important as stepping stones as well. And that was really important to us because if you are to conserve certain areas, it's important to have both kinds in the same area because you typically have limited resources to use for conservation. The other thing that we wanted to look at was how well are the protected area schemes doing in terms of capturing areas that are important for connectivity. So what you're seeing here is on the y-axis areas that were important as hubs, and then on your x-axis going from left to right for each of these 3 graphs are the static layers going from 1 in 2 and 1 in 100-year floods. And then we split them up into habitats that were protected versus habitats that were not protected, and we looked at 3 different protection schemes: protected areas, Directory of Important Wetlands in Australia in the middle, and the Ramsar Convention on your right-hand side. So what we found was that actually the areas that are protected are good for connectivity as well. And this was one of the, I guess, few good news environmental studies and good results for us. I guess lots of environmental studies might have doom and gloom answers, and we were quite happy with this because none of these protection schemes included connectivity among their criteria, but they were actually doing quite well in terms of protecting habitats that were good for connectivity. We then wanted to incorporate the true dynamic captured from our satellite data. So we considered that as the true dynamic. So we took our time series of surface water maps. We had about 99 per season per year surface water maps. And then we applied connectivity on top of it. And then we looked at where are the areas that are important as hubs and stepping stones over space and in time. According to us at that point in time, in 2018, this was one of the largest ecological networks because it was going, again, across a large space and also in time. So what have we found? On your left-hand side are habitats that are important as stepping stones, in the middle as hubs, and on your right-hand side you have the amount of habitat across this entire area. Areas shown in yellow are the ones that are more important as hubs or stepping stones. So just looking at this, what jumps at you? What's the first thing that jumps at you?
But there are periods when there's a lack of connectivity.
Mm-hmm. What else? Yeah. Those are great examples. I guess what jumps at me is that this is really dynamic. So I guess if we were to only have snapshots in time, we would obviously miss out on all of these dynamics. So again, the point that I'm trying to make is that for dynamic systems, we should be using time series of satellite data and incorporate this in our analysis to be able to get an understanding of these dynamics and quantify these dynamics. Just to show this in a less dynamic way, we basically took the entire time series and we grouped the time series, the bottom 25 driest time steps, the top 25% wettest time steps, so that's our wet, and then everything else in the middle was average. So what you're seeing here is with orange habitats that are important as stepping stones, with blue as hubs and yellow both. And what you're seeing here is that during dry periods, we pretty much had habitats that were important as hubs and stepping stones along the major river systems. I guess you don't know the major river systems, but these are the major river systems. During average times, we had more habitats, so more connectivity, and then during wet times, we had lots of interesting areas that started popping out. Some of the interesting ones are located here in the riverina. This is an area that's irrigated. So it turns out that in our modeling, irrigated agriculture was actually good for amphibian connectivity. Now, this is a controversial result when we go to talk to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and when we talk to, I guess people, so it can be a controversial result in terms of water usage, but in our modeling, these turned out as important for connectivity. The other area that was important is located right here, and this is pretty much in the Paru area, the northwest, is pretty much the only area that's not developed across this basin. The other thing that was interesting to us was that, again, if we were to give suggestions for conservation or for prioritizing resources for conservation, we would definitely suggest this part of the basin, the northwestern part. Most of the protected areas are located right here in the south and in the center part of the basin, whereas there are very few areas that are protected right here. So these would be the area that we would suggest for as a priority area for conservation. And lastly, we wanted to look at how these hydroclimatic variability, so the big drought and the big wet, impacted connectivity. So again, across space and time. This is just a quick zoom in the middle, showing you a network during the driest season, and on your right-hand side during the wettest season. The size of the bubble is basically proportional to the size of the habitat, and then the links are the edges, so how connected this network was. And we looked at connectivity across the entire basin, so using what we would call a global topology metric to see how this changes during hydroclimatic variability. So basically we looked at the total area connected versus the total habitat area. And what we found was that while the total habitat area was decreasing during dry periods very fast, the total area that was connected wasn't decreasing as fast. So the way we interpreted this was that there is some resilience in the system in terms of connectivity, given that the habitat was decreasing at a faster rate. The summary is cut off. So I guess just to conclude, we used a time series of satellite data of surface water maps for 26 years, seasonally continuous, and then we used this data set in down-the-track applications, looking at vegetation dynamics and vegetation response to flooding, looking at vegetation health response to flooding, as well as landscape connectivity to start looking at this system from various angles and try to get a better picture of the system. And I guess with that, I'm really thankful to my former lab members and all the people that have been involved in this work, and to my funding sources. So I'll just end with this, a short time series of my previous lab in Australia and my very young lab here, a 3-week-old lab. So Molly and Vinny, whom you probably met by now. So I look forward to growing as a lab, and thank you very much all for coming, especially given the rain outside. And I'm not sure if I have...
So say we have a few minutes for questions.
Excellent. And if you don't have any questions, I have a question. This is my question too.
What was the predominant change in land use from what to what?
From natural environments to dryland agriculture, and from irrigated agriculture to dryland agriculture.
There was no urban land use?
Not as much in this basin. The basin is pretty agricultural. Most of the major cities are kind of on the edge of the basin.
When did your network analysis, did you go to the next step and see if you could determine areas that could be either modified or protected to maintain the more connectivity during the dry seasons?
You mean like individual habitats or just...
Individual locations that might add to the connectivity of the network.
So we kind of did that with the hubs and stepping stones. You mean to add, to basically restore new habitats?
Restore new habitat?
We did not look at adding habitats into the network, but that's, yeah, that's a great suggestion. That's for Molly.
So how did you classify the trees that you identified via LiDAR? How did you classify the health categories?
We basically had tree health experts, like eucalypt tree health experts, and then we went out in the field and visually assessed the trees. There is a typical assessment protocol that's used for eucalypts, and you have 2 people, I was one of them, assessing the tree health.
Okay, so not remotely.
No, so we had on-ground data to use with our LiDAR data to get our accuracy assessment, but yeah, that's a great point. Yes, I didn't make it very clearly.
So the follow-up question, you started that conversation with like treating special qualities. Would that same technique work well for other trees that are shaped, you know?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and that was actually one of my questions for you, but I forgot to ask you, so I'm asking you now. So I would say yes, because these are very complex trees. So I think if these methods work for those trees, I guess I would be confident to say that they might work for other trees. But I wanted to ask you, are there similar trees in this area? And which ones?
Actually, Mirela, a related question. So what about landscapes where there's a much greater diversity of species?
Yeah, that's another great point. So in our study area, about 85–87% of the whole place was a single species. So that worked out pretty well. I don't know. That's something to look into.
Markedly more heterogeneous.
Yeah.
And it seems like the computational complexity of that would be is where, like, it's a very resource intensive algorithm. So you must have been doing it on a relatively small area, or?
We did it on a small area. We actually only had that much funding to acquire LiDAR. So yeah.
So you haven't tried it on.
So you mentioned your accuracy was about 68%.
Yeah.
How much do you think it would go up if you integrated spectral data with it, which might answer Jay's question about multiple tree species and different structures and things?
So we actually did, for our health algorithms, so the 68% was for identifying individual trees, and then our accuracy for health actually incorporated hyperspectral data.
Okay.
However, for these particular species, when there's a drought, what they do, they start dropping branches. So the tree looks pretty much the same as it would look when it's healthy, and then all of a sudden, it just drops branches. So LiDAR was the one that captured this. So basically, when you see a crown with very few branches, that's when you know the tree is not doing so well. So we didn't see a lot in terms of hyperspectral data for this particular species, but I would suspect that it's very different in other places.
I noticed that the trees were very segregated for each other. You didn't have a lot of dense vegetation where the branches are competing for space.
We did have that in some areas, and that's where the algorithm didn't do so well. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's all thank